Okay, this is one of my favorite weekends at Mission Hills. We do this a few times a year. We're doing baptisms, and I'm actually wet right now. I don't know if you can see it, but I was high-fiving and giving people hugs in the last service, and I got baptism all over me, and it's awesome. It's one of my favorite things to do. Before we get to that, though, I want to talk to you a little bit today about God's greatest weapon for you, your greatest weapon when you're feeling weak. And can we be vulnerable with each other? Can we start off by being a little bit vulnerable? How many of us would say, by a show of hands, yeah, I know what it's like to feel weak. There's been a season where I have felt weak, right? Maybe it's a season where you felt like you just weren't enough of something. How many of us have ever felt like I'm just not enough? Or maybe it's a season where you didn't feel like you had enough of some kind of a resource, right? How many of us have felt like I just didn't have enough? Okay, so it looks like kind of all of us. Why don't you do this? Once you find somebody next to you, give them a fist bump and just say, me too, right? We all know what it's like to be weak. Well, I want to talk to you today about your greatest weapon when you're feeling weak. And if you want to follow along, we're going to be in Judges chapter 7, picking up in verse 9, Judges 7:9. If you're just joining us, and we got a lot of people joining us, and it's family weekend, so we got some kids that may not have been part of this series. So let me get you up to speed. The nation of Israel, God's people, are weak. They're in a season of weakness. And it's kind of their fault because they walked away from God. They stopped worshiping the true God. And they started worshiping some false gods. And of all the things that false gods cannot give you, strength is one of them, okay? And there's a lot of things false gods can't give you. They claim they can give them to you, but they absolutely cannot deliver on the promise. But of all the things that false gods claim they deliver and cannot deliver, true strength is at the top of that list. They cannot give you true strength. And so the Israelites are weak, but they hit rock bottom and they look up, they cry out to God, and God leans in and he starts working in the life of a man named Gideon. Now, when God went to Gideon in the first place, he called him a mighty warrior. And Gideon's response was, I'm not a warrior, I'm weak. In fact, he said, I'm the weakest of my clan. My clan's the weakest in my tribe. My tribe's the weakest in all of Israel. So I'm the weakest of the weakest of the weak, okay? And God goes, good, that's perfect. Because that gives me a little bit of room to move and nobody's going to get confused about who actually does what I'm getting ready to do, right? Okay, so that's kind of our situation. So God has actually begun to do some things, and Gideon's probably feeling a little encouraged. He's probably feeling a little bit stronger because God has actually done some miracles through Gideon. And so now 32,000 men have assembled to fight against the Midianites, the army that is oppressing them. 32,000. And Gideon's feeling pretty good about that. He's not feeling great about it because the Midianites have brought 135,000. So it's 32,000, 135,000. If you do those numbers, it's basically 4-1. And those are not great odds, right? And so Gideon basically, I think we saw this last week, Gideon basically kind of went to God and went, like, are you okay with those odds, God? Those don't feel great to me. 4-1, you good with those odds? And God went, I'm not. Let's take 22,000 away. So he took 22,000 of Gideon's 32,000 away. So now he's got 10,000. And Gideon's like, I don't know what kind of math you're doing, God, but we went from 4-1 to 13-1 odds. You're good with these odds? And God went, I'm really not. Let's take 9,700 of those away and just leave you with 300. So Gideon has gone from 4-1 to 450-1 odds. 300 men against 135,000 of the Midianites. And it's the night before the battle, and Gideon has gone to bed, and that's where we join the story. This is Judges chapter 7, verse 9. It says, during the night, the Lord said to Gideon, get up, go down against the camp, which means attack the camp, because I'm going to give it into your hands. So God comes to him in the middle of the night, and he says, get up. You notice he didn't tell him wake up. He didn't have to tell him to wake up because Gideon was already awake, right? And I don't know about you, but like for me, when it's the middle of the night and I'm awake and I'm thinking about things, I don't know about you, but I find that in the middle of the night, my thoughts are only happy and I'm just feeling strong. So, wait a minute, I got that backwards. Middle of the night, like that's when I'm catastrophizing. That's when I'm like, how bad could things really get? I'm imagining new things that could possibly go wrong, right? I'm inventing new horrible possibilities, and I'm feeling weak. How many of us know the middle of the night, your thinking's against you and you're feeling weak? How many of us know what I'm talking about? Yeah. That's where Gideon is, and it's interesting. God comes to him in that moment of weakness when he's probably been thinking, and now it's like he's in his worst possible state of mind, and God goes, okay, now let's get up and go. Why does God do this? We've been seeing this throughout this whole series. God often comes to us when we're weak, and the reason is simply because in our weakness we trust God's strength more completely. It's in that moment when we are at our weakest that we don't have any illusions that maybe I'm strong enough, maybe I'm smart enough, maybe I'm rich enough, maybe I've got the right relationship, maybe the things around me are strong enough. And no, in our weakness, we go, God, I don't have any choice but to trust you and you alone. And so God goes to him, he says, I want you to get up. And I want you to go down because I have given the enemies into your hand. Now, it's interesting, if I can just geek out for a second. The New International Version translates what God says here is, because I am going to give it into your hands, like this is a future thing. In the original Hebrew, though, the way that God says this literally is, I have given it. He uses a past tense. He says, it's done. Like the war is kind of over, and the battle's done, and Gideon's like, no, it's not. They're still there. But God says, I have given them into your hands. And this is an interesting thing. God does it a lot of times in the Old Testament that uses that particular Hebrew tense to basically talk about things in the future as though they were in the past. In fact, as scholars, we have a word for it. We call it the prophetic perfect. In Hebrew, the perfect tense means that something is already finished, it's completed. But God often uses the perfect when he's talking about what is still in process. He uses the word for what is completed when everything is still actually going on. We call it the prophetic perfect. And the reality is God often speaks into our lives and he says, from my perspective, this is certain. But right now, you can't see it. Okay? You might not be a follower of Jesus yet. But God loves you. He's already done everything necessary to forgive you. His son has already died on the cross. He's been raised from the dead, and he's just waiting for you to receive everything he's done. God has written your name in his book of life. From his perspective, your adoption into his family is certain. You just can't see it yet. Or maybe you've said yes to Jesus. You're a follower of Jesus, and God says this amazing thing. He says, I will continue the work that I began in you. Well, what I have begun in you, I will carry on to completion. You're going to become more and more like my son, Jesus. In fact, God says you're done. You're perfected. And I don't know about you, but did anybody get up and look in the mirror this morning and went, I look an awful lot like Jesus. Man, I'm so holy and good and kind and forget. Nobody? Yeah, because you're still in process, but God says, yeah, but from my perspective, that's certain. And the reality is a lot of times when God says, from my perspective, this is certain, we go, but God, I can't see it yet. And here's the connection between what is certain and our ability to see it. Notice what he tells Gideon. He says, I've given the army in your hand. From my perspective, he says, it is certain. But he tells Gideon, what do you got to do? He says, you got to get up and go down. See, for us to see what God knows is certain, we have to take a step. We have to take a step of faith. If you're not a follower of Jesus, you have to say yes to following Jesus. If you are a follower of Jesus, to get to that place where you are complete and perfected because of his work in your life, you have to keep trusting him. You have to keep taking that next step of obedience, right? For us to see what God has declared as certain, we have to take a step of faith. For Gideon, he says, you got to get up and you got to go down. Now, here's the problem with those steps of faith. They're scary, aren't they? I mean, the reality is that steps of faith are always scary. If they weren't scary, they wouldn't require any faith, would they? And so what God calls Gideon to do is a little bit scary. He says, get up, go down against the army because I have given it into your hands. And then God says this, and this is so interesting. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they're saying. And afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp. So he and Purah and his servant went down to the outposts of the camp. It's so interesting. God says, here's the step you need to take. I'm telling you what's certain, but for you to see what is certain, you're going to have to take a step of faith. You have to attack, okay? And then he says, but if you're afraid to attack, if you're too afraid to take that step, if that step feels like too big a step, let me give you a smaller step. You're not ready to attack? Go play James Bond. All right, go sneak into the enemy camp, take a look around, and I promise when you do that, you'll get the courage that you need to take that next step. And I love that about God, don't you? Here's the reality. Let's just be honest with each other. Trusting God is always scary, right? Trusting God is always scary. Every step of faith I've ever taken in my life has involved a certain amount of fear. Trusting God is always scary. And so God often says, okay, well then let me give you a smaller step. Because God knows that we are always people with some faith and some fear. I think sometimes we read the Bible and we go, oh, all these people had this amazing faith and they had no fear. Can I just tell you, that's wrong. That's not true at all. We go, Gideon did this amazing thing. He must have been a man of incredible faith. He was, but he also had incredible fear. How do I know that? What did God say? God said, if you are afraid to attack, if you're afraid to take that next step, then instead just go down with your servant and kind of check things out. And what did Gideon do? He's like, I'm taking that second option. That sounds like a much more reasonable, like palatable, I think I can probably handle that small step, okay? So what that means is that Gideon was what? He was afraid. And sometimes, again, we think this reality is that people in the Bible, they're just full of faith, they have no fear. That's not true. God actually in the Bible, it's so interesting, God 365 plus times says, do not be afraid. Why would he tell his people to do not be afraid? Because they do be afraid. Because they already are afraid. He knows that. And sometimes I think we have this idea that faith and fear are opposites of each other, right? You can't have both of them. Like we think that they're like, like the seesaw, right? Like, if your faith comes down hard on the seesaw, then fear just gets catapulted out of your life. Or on the other hand, if you're a person of faith, then your faith comes down hard and fear gets catapulted out of your life. I'm gonna tell you, that's never been true for me. I don't think it's been true for you. We are all a mixture of fear and faith, because the reality is, let me tell you something, fear is not the opposite of faith. Sometimes we think it is, but it's not. Fear is not the opposite of faith, but it is an opponent of it. Do you hear me? It's not the opposite. You can have both of them at the same time, but it is an opponent of your faith because it is always working to keep you from taking that next step. Because fear knows that if you take a step of faith, your faith is going to grow. A couple years ago, I was playing Frisbee with my golden retriever, and it was February, and we were out, and we had this little frozen pond, and I had this idea that'd be really fun. I'm going to throw the Frisbee onto the ice, and then my dog's going to run out and slip and everything. I'm going to get a video for TikTok. It's going to be awesome. And so I threw it out, and she started, and then she saw the ice, and she just stopped. She's like, And I was like, well, but you got to, the Frisbee, you got to go. And she looked at me like, you go. Now, I'm going to tell you something, like it had been really cold for a long time. It had been really, really cold for several weeks, and I was pretty confident that the ice was thick enough to hold me. I didn't really have any real questions about that intellectually. You could say I had a fair amount of faith. But I had some fear too. And so, I got the biggest rock I could find, and I threw it as high as I could and as far out as I could just to kind of see what happened. And it hit the ice, and it made a solid, very satisfying thunk. Nothing cracked, nothing broke, and it's continued to slide. I was like, okay, yeah, my faith is well placed, right? Because it's never about how much faith you have. It's about what your faith is in. You understand that, right? It's not about how much faith you have in God. It's about what you have faith in. God is worthy of your faith, right? So I actually was like, yeah, I've got good reason to believe this ice can hold me. Like, my faith is in the right thing. Having said that, the reality is if you would watch me, you would see this war between fear and faith, because I was standing at the edge of the lake going, I mean, that would have been the video that should have made it on TikTok, right? But it's interesting, I took the one step and it held me. So then I took another step and then another step. And pretty soon, like, it's not that I no longer had any fear, but its voice just got a lot quieter, and my faith moved me out, and I got to the middle of the lake and I picked up the Frisbee, and right then my dog came running out. I was like, fine, whatever, yeah. But see, that's the reality, okay? Fear is not the opposite of faith, but it's the opponent of it, and it's always trying to keep you from taking that next step. And so God in his grace often gives us smaller steps because he knows, here's what he knows that small steps build big faith. You go, well, this step didn't take that much faith. That's fine. It's like an investment, right? We invest so that things get bigger, so that things grow. Little steps of faith grow big faith over time. And so God gives us little steps. So yeah, you're not ready to trust Jesus with your soul. God says, okay, would you trust me with your next Sunday? Would you give me an hour next Sunday? Would you go to church? You're not ready to trust me with all your relationships. Maybe you're in a relationship that honestly, you know that it's toxic and you shouldn't be in it, but like, what's the other alternatives? And you're scared to break free from that. And so he says, okay, you're not ready to trust me with that relationship. Would you join a life group? Would you join a small group, women's Bible study or something? Get some other relationships around you. Would you trust me with that? Oh, you're not ready to trust me with your schedule? Right? Okay, would you trust me with an hour or two a month? Would you join a serve team or find a place where you could go serve and give your time to serving others? It's just a small step. Would you do that? Oh, maybe you sense that God's calling you to something. I was talking to somebody recently that said, I feel like I'm afraid. So often that happens. They go, I'm afraid God's calling me into vocational ministry. I was like, been there. Maybe you're not ready to trust God with your life that way, but would you trust him with a week next summer and go on a short-term trip? I don't know what your small step is, but here's what I know. I know that God in his grace and his mercy gives us the small steps because small steps build big faith. So he says, yeah, I understand. Attacking the camp feels like a lot. So here's what I want you to just go down and play James Bond. Just go down and sort of spy things out. So Gideon gets up, and they head down there. Now, it says, the Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. And I want you to think about this for a second. God said, okay, I understand you're afraid, and if your fear is too big to keep you from taking that next step, I'll give you a smaller step, so just get up and check things out. And so Gideon gets up, and they head down there, and this is what they see. They see that there's so many people, they're like locusts on the land, and you can't even count their camels, or you can't even count their camels. And Gideon's like, man, I can count my camels. I can count my soldiers. I can count their numbers and fingers and toes. There's not that many of them. I can't even count their camels. And this is just so interesting. Like, I don't know what he expected, but sometimes I think if I trust God and I take that next small step of faith, I'm going to be like, why on earth was I afraid of this? This is nothing. That is not what Gideon experienced. Gideon took the step and he saw everything and he was like, God, this is why I was scared. And I've seen that in my life. Maybe you have too. So here's the reality. When God asks us to trust him with a step of faith, it's not so that we're going to discover there was nothing to be afraid of. Those 365 plus times when God says, do not be afraid, here's what you need to understand. When God says, do not be afraid, it's not because there's nothing worthy of your fear. There may be something absolutely worth being afraid of. When God says, do not be afraid, it's not because there's nothing that's worthy of your fear. It's because there's someone who is more worthy of your faith. Do you hear me, church? God's not going to lie to you. He's not going to make you feel like what you're facing, the enemy's coming against you, are meaningless or worthless or insignificant. No. He says the thing is that I'm bigger. That big thing that you're afraid of, well, you have a big God that is worth putting your faith in. And Gideon sees it. He's like, God, this is exactly why I was laying awake. This is exactly why I was worried. And God just says, keep going. And so Gideon arrived. Just as a man was telling a friend his dream. I had a dream, he was saying. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed. And his friend responded, this can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, of son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands. And can we just admit that this is a weird conversation over here? I mean, everything about it's weird, right? First off, the guy was like, I just had a dream about bread. When's the last time you dreamed about bread? I mean, unless you're on a low-carb diet, in which case that's a totally different conversation, right? But he didn't just dream about bread, he dreamed about weaponized bread. When was the last time you dreamed about dangerous bread, right? That's crazy. And honestly, crazier than the dream is his friend. His friend hears about this barley loaf that comes in and destroys a Midian tent, and his friend goes, this can be nothing other than Gideon, our enemy. Like, really? Like, I wouldn't have even thought that was a possible interpretation. And you're telling me it's the only possible interpretation? Like, it couldn't be anything but that? What are you talking about? Well, here's what you need to understand, you might not know, and that is that barley, it's so interesting, barley was kind of considered worthless grain. It wasn't nearly as good as the other grain. In fact, it sold for half the price of wheat. And so remember Gideon, right? When God came to Gideon and said, mighty warrior, he said, I'm not a warrior, I'm weak. I'm worthless. I'm the weakest of the weakest of the weakest of a weak nation. I'm as weak as they come. And from Gideon's perspective, his weakness made him worthless. And what's interesting here is that his enemies know his weakness. His enemies know that he is not a great soldier. His enemies know that he's not a great leader in battle. His enemies know that he is an inferior warrior. Barley bread. But you notice his enemies also know what I think Gideon doesn't know. His enemies know that Gideon's weakness doesn't make him worthless. His enemies know that somehow his weakness is actually leaving room for God to do something only God can do, and that God's at move in his life. And even though Gideon has a tremendous weakness, that doesn't make him worthless. And God's going to do something with him. And so it's just so interesting. His enemy knew what Gideon didn't. His enemies worried about what God was going to do in spite of his weakness. Gideon had been laying awake worrying that his weakness made him worthless, right? It's so interesting to me that I think your enemy, I think my enemy, our spiritual enemy, knows what we don't know. Your weakness doesn't make you worthless. You hear me, church? Look at me in the eye. Your weakness doesn't make you worthless. I'm not saying you're not weak. I'm not saying you're wrong about your weakness. I'm saying you're wrong about this reality, this lie the devil keeps trying to tell you, which is that your weakness makes you worthless. Your enemy knows it's not true, but he's desperately trying to get you to keep believing it, because if you start trusting God in your weakness, you're going to find out that you weren't worthless at all. And the God of infinite worth and value and strength and power is more than happy to start moving in that place that you have acknowledged that you got some room for it. Your weakness doesn't make you worthless. Now, when Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and he worshiped. And I want you to pay attention to what he did, and I want you to pay attention to where he did it. What did he do? He bowed down and he worshiped. He didn't attack the camp. He didn't run back to tell his friends, his soldiers about the dream. He bowed down and he worshiped. By the way, if you're kind of new to church and you're not quite sure what worship is, actually I find that a lot of people who have been to church for a long time not quite sure what it is. Sometimes we go, well, it's singing, right? It's songs that we sing, it's those kinds of things. Well, that's one of the ways we do it, but it's not what it is. What worship is worship is this recognition, this acknowledgement, this submission. Hey, God, you're God, I'm not. You're strong, I'm not, and so all my chips are on you. All my faith is going to be in you. All my trust is going to be, it's not going to be my intelligence. It's not going to be on my bank account. It's not going to be on my friends. It's not going to be on the resources around me. You're God. You're strong. I'm not God. I'm not strong. So I'm going to put all my trust in you. That's worship. And there's lots of ways we express it. We might express it by singing. We might express it by praying. We might express it by choosing to serve and to live generously. There's all kinds of ways that we do it. But at the heart of it is you're God and I'm not, and my trust is in you. You with me? That's what Gideon does. Now, did you notice where he did it? He did it in the enemy camp. He didn't go back. He didn't wait till the war was over. He bowed down and he worshiped, surrounded by his enemies. And this is so important because here's what I think sometimes happens. It's a mistake I've made a lot, and probably you've made this mistake in your life. I think we do it as followers of Jesus a lot. We have this tendency to think that worship is how we celebrate the power of God. And that's true, it is. When God moves in our lives, we celebrate the power of God, and we call that worship, and it is. But here's the thing, worship isn't just how we celebrate the power of God, it's how we seize it. It's how we take possession of it. It's how we bring it into our lives and put our trust in it and in God completely so that we can move forward in faith to that point that fear is no longer keeping us from everything that God has for us. Worship's not just how we celebrate the power of God, it's how we seize it and it strengthens our lives. And so Gideon does it. He bows down and he worships right there in the enemy camp. And then he returned to the camp of Israel and he called out, "Get up. The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." And dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them with torches inside. It's like, it's time to go to war. Here's your weapons. Here's a trumpet for you. And here's an empty jar for you. And I promise you the second guy was like, but you have a sword for me and maybe a jar of oil, like it's on fire for me. No, you're going to give me this. Oh, also a trumpet? And the third guy, and 300 of them, they each get trumpets and empty jars. Here's the thing about the word trumpet. The Hebrew word is shofar. Anybody know that word? If you've been in church a while, you may have run across that word. Because the shofar was a holy instrument. And it was used to summon people to war. Sometimes they did use it to summon people to war. You could call it an instrument of war, so to speak. But more often in the Bible, the shofar was used to summon people to, guess what? To worship. It was a way that they summoned the people to come to the temple, to the tabernacle, to the synagogues. So you're like, oh, hang on a second. So which is it? Is it an instrument of war or is it an instrument of worship? And the answer is yes. Because it's both. Because for the people of God, listen to me. For the people of God, our instruments of worship are our instruments of war. Because worship's not just how we celebrate the power of God, it's how we seize it. It's how we trust in it. And so he arms them for battle with an instrument of worship and an empty jar. I don't know, if I'd been, the Israelites would have been like, I kind of get the instrument of worship. I sort of get that because God's done this before, by the way. They remember the story of when their ancestors came into the promised land and they faced the city of Jericho. And the city of Jericho, the walls fell, not because they hit them with battering rams, but because they blew their shofars. And so they knew, sometimes God uses our instruments of worship as though they were instruments of war. So they kind of maybe got that, but they were like, but couldn't we also have a sword? Just a small dagger in the other hand? Well, what are you supposed to do with empty jars? And here's the interesting thing about empty jars. In the Bible, empty jars are a symbol of weakness. They're a symbol of weakness. After this season of life for the Israelites, they came to another season where they forgot about God. They stopped worshiping him. They started worshiping false idols again. And the prophet Jeremiah spoke about what happened in the weakness that they brought on themselves. When the Babylonians conquered them, Jeremiah wrote, "Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, has devoured us. He has thrown us into confusion. He has made us an empty jar." It's a symbol of weakness. So it's very interesting that they are armed with the symbol of weakness. And we called this series The Gift of Weakness. We don't think about weakness as a gift, but the reality is that weakness is a gift because it forces us to trust in the only one who's actually strong enough to deliver us. So he arms them with a symbol of weakness. But there's something else I want to tell you about the empty jars. They're not just a symbol of weakness in the Bible. They're also a symbol of God having an opportunity to do something extraordinary. I think at the time that Elisha the prophet encountered a widow who was destitute, and she and her son were about to die because they had nothing. And he told her, here's what I want you to do. Elisha said, go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. And they went and they found as many empty jars as they could. And then God did a miracle, and all those empty jars were filled with oil. And as long as there was another empty jar, there was another miracle coming. The moment they stopped having empty jars, the moment they ran out of empty jars, the miracle stopped. The oil stopped being miraculously produced. Isn't that interesting? See, here's the thing about empty jars. God likes them. See, God likes jars that are empty because they give him an opportunity to do something extraordinary. If you're here today and you're feeling kind of like an empty jar, can I just tell you, it's not a bad place to be. It doesn't feel great, but it's actually a really good place to be. God loves jars that are empty because they give him an opportunity to do something extraordinary. And so they're armed with instruments of worship and with empty jars. And Gideon told them, watch me. Follow my lead. And when I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow their trumpets, then from all around the camp, blow yours and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. So the first act of war is an act of what? It's an act of worship. They blow the shofar and they shout for the Lord. That's worship, right? So Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and they broke the jars that were in their hands. And the 3 companies blew their trumpets and smashed the jars, grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets like they were to blow. By the way, notice that, in their right hand. Now, if you're left-handed, just ignore this for a second. I have a left-handed daughter. She's amazing. But in the ancient world, left hands were not the strongest of the hands, and so they preferred the right-handed. What do they put in their right hand? Their instrument of worship. What little strength they have is summoned for the purposes of what? Of worship. In their right hands, the trumpets, the shofars they were to blow. And they shouted, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. And I love that. Please don't miss that. They blow an instrument of worship. They shout about a sword. They blow an instrument of worship and they shout about an instrument of war. That's for those of us who are just a little bit slow. It's for me because it took me years to understand what was going on there. And I finally realized, oh, right, because my instrument of war is my instrument of worship. That's my best weapon. That's my greatest tool when I'm feeling weak is actually worship. So they shouted a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. Now, while each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. I mean, they're running, and there was no physical blow. Nobody struck a blow of war. There was just this blow of worship. And the battle's over. They're running, crying out as they fled. And when the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. So instruments of war got involved, but they weren't in the hands of the Israelites. The enemy turned on itself. The enemy fled to Beth Shittah, towards Zerara, as far as the border of Abel Meholah, near Tabbath. Israelites from Naphtali, Asher, and all of Manasseh were called out, and they pursued the Midianites. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth Barah. And so all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they seized the waters of the Jordan as far as Beth Barah. They won. With what? Worship. See, we win the war with worship. It's not just how we celebrate the power of God, it's how we seize it. We win the war with worship. And here's the incredible thing about worship. It doesn't matter how weak you are never too weak to worship. You may feel like you're too weak to sing a song. Maybe the best you can do is whisper a word of worship. I remember several years ago, I was kind of new to Mission Hills, and I'm going to be honest, the job was bigger and the problems harder than I expected. And there was some stuff going on, and I was overwhelmed. And I was feeling inadequate to the task, confused about the future. I was missing the relationships from my last church. I was missing the trust and the respect that I'd earned over several years, decades actually with them. And I was in a new place and having to earn respect and trust of leadership and the congregation and facing some of these big challenges. And I was just feeling about as weak as I'd ever felt, and I did what I usually do in that moment. I went for a walk. And I remembered this lesson. God had taught it to me many years ago. But I was just feeling so weak, and so I was like, I'm going to go for a walk, and I'm going to sing some worship songs. And I started trying, and I was just like, I don't have it in me. And I remember vividly just kind of whispering. It was the words from one of my favorite songs at the time. It was a line that went, my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. You might know that line. All I could do is whisper it. And I remember on that walk going, my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. And I'd love to tell you that the clouds parted and the light shone upon me and the angels sang. None of that happened. But I will tell you that there was this little thing that just felt slightly better. I don't know what it was. It was so small. So small that I was like, I'm not even sure anything really happened, but something felt just a tiny little bit better. And I realized I had just a little bit more strength to be able to say it a little bit louder. That's all I could do. And so I said, a little bit louder, I said, yeah, my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. And again, just a little tiny bit better. And I remember walking a little farther and going, and my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. Just a little better. So I said just a little bit louder. If you know the song, you want to do it with me? Because my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. Still no angels. Still no light. Still no whoa. But just a little bit better. And so I said it with me. I said, my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. Do it with one more time, church. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. I was like, okay, I can go back into the battle. Because we win the war with worship. Hey, God, I want to pray over my friends. A lot of them are here today and they're feeling weak. Feeling like they're not enough. And in love, you're saying, yeah, you're not. They feel like they don't have enough. And in love, you say, yeah, you don't. But you have access to one who is. God, I just pray that in this moment, you would strengthen them. Show them a small next step to take in their faith. Maybe that's to say yes to following Jesus for the first time. Maybe it's to trust you in some other way, that next step of obedience that you're speaking. Lord, give them the strength to do that, and as they do that, would you give them a little bit more strength for that next step? And with those small steps, would you build a bigger faith in a big God? Lord, I know there's some here today who they don't feel like they've got the strength to swing a sword, but maybe they've got the strength to sing a song. Or maybe they don't have the strength to sing a song. Maybe they've got just enough strength to whisper a word of worship. Say, God, you're good. But Lord, would you just move among us? Would you shout your love over us? Speak your strength into us, the strength just to take that next step of worship. Because that's how we win our war. In Jesus' name, amen.